They made her kneel, in uniform, in court. And the whole room watched in stunned silence as Major Avery Sinclair, a decorated U.S. Army officer, lowered herself onto the cold tiled floor, not because she was guilty, not because she was ashamed, but because 2 local police officers wanted to make an example out of her. The judge said it was a matter of courtroom decorum. The officers called it maintaining control. But the look in Avery's eyes told a different story, one of dignity, discipline, and defiance. She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She didn't fight, because she didn't have to. The cameras were already rolling. And in a world where body cam footage, civil rights violations, and police abuse of power can go viral in hours, the truth had already begun to right itself. The woman they humiliated wasn't just any defendant. She was a major in the U.S. Army, a black woman who had served her country with honor across 2 continents, and the only person in that courtroom who had actually sworn an oath to defend the Constitution with her life. But these officers didn't know who she was. Not yet. All they saw was a confident black woman standing up in a courtroom, challenging their authority. So they did what too many do when power feels threatened. They tried to strip her of her humanity, forced her to kneel, in public. In silence. They thought it would break her, but what they didn't see was what the world would soon find out. Avery Sinclair wasn't just a soldier, she was a symbol. Of every woman who's been silenced. Of every veteran who came home to a country that turned its back. Of every black American who's been forced to swallow injustice just to survive. And as she knelt in front of a wooden bench dressed in a starched army uniform, her back straight, her jaw clenched, and her eyes fixed forward, it was clear. This wasn't submission. It was a strategy. And in that exact moment, somewhere far beyond the courtroom walls, a military satellite pinged to life. A legal defense team opened the file, and a federal investigation was quietly launched. Because Avery Sinclair didn't need to raise her voice. She had the Department of Defense, the Service Members Civil Relief Act, and the entire internet behind her. And those 2 officers? They were about to learn the hard way that sometimes the person you try to break is the very one who can take your badge. This isn't just a story about racial profiling or police misconduct. It's about a system that forgets who it's supposed to protect, and the one soldier who reminded them. Major Avery Sinclair wasn't supposed to be in that courtroom, not like that. Not in handcuffs. Not flanked by 2 officers who treated her like a criminal instead of the decorated soldier she was. But none of that happened by accident. It began 2 days earlier in a town called Wexler Ridge, a sleepy southern enclave tucked between pine forests and old money, where everyone knew everyone. And where power didn't like to be questioned. Avery had flown in on a quiet Thursday afternoon, dressed in civilian clothes, hoping for nothing more than a few days of peace with her grandmother. She was on temporary leave from active duty after a 16-month rotation overseas commanding an urban warfare training division. The Army had offered her D.C., a promotion, and a full staff. Instead, she asked for Mississippi. She said she wanted to breathe again, but Wexler Ridge wasn't the kind of place that welcomed outsiders with opinions. And it definitely wasn't ready for a black woman in uniform who wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. On her 2nd day in town, Avery accompanied her grandmother to the courthouse, an old brick building with faded flags and creaking benches to support an old friend, James B.O. Thompson, a retired Marine-turned-construction worker who had been arrested for allegedly shoplifting from a local grocery store. The charge, 2 cans of soup and a loaf of bread. Avery knew B.O. She had served with men like him. Men who came back from war to a country that barely remembered their names, let alone honored their sacrifice. He wasn't stealing. He was surviving. When Bo's public defender fumbled through his opening statement and the prosecutor scoffed at the idea of military PTSD, Avery stood up. Not to disrupt, not to grandstand, but to object Respectfully, firmly, she questioned the process, the fairness. She asked why Beau's service record hadn't been entered into evidence. Why had no one bothered to verify the store security footage? She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She simply refused to sit back while another veteran was crushed by the system. That was her first mistake. The judge, an aging white man named Clifford Denton, known around town for his zero-tolerance stance on courtroom disruptions, banged his gavel and warned her to remain silent. When Avery continued, calmly but unwavering, he issued an order for her removal. The two bailiffs, C.T. McLean and O.F.C. Turner, stepped forward, grabbed her arms, and dragged her out of the courtroom like a common delinquent. The next morning, she was charged with contempt of court, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest. All fabricated. All meant to send a message. That's when things took a darker turn. In her holding cell, still dressed in her service uniform, Avery was denied access to legal counsel. When she requested to contact her commanding officer, she was told, "You ain't in Baghdad now, sweetheart." The tone was mocking. The intent was clear. These men didn't just want to silence her. They wanted to break her dot, and Wexler Ridge made it easy for them. The town operated like a closed loop. The sheriff, the judge, the DI, all from the same families, all hunting from the same tree stand. This wasn't just a case of police abuse. It was systemic injustice wrapped in a Southern accent. Back in court, Avery was brought in chains for arraignment. Her wrists were bruised, her knuckles scraped from the cuffs, but her back, still straight, her eyes, still sharp. That's when Judge Denton leaned over the bench and said, "If you want the court's mercy, Major, you'll show some humility." He motioned to the officers, "Have her kneel." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. A child in the gallery asked, "Why she gotta do that?" An older black man in a veteran's cap stood up and whispered, "She earned those stripes." But no one intervened. Not yet. And so Avery knelt calm, silent, unmoved. What the judge and the officers didn't know was that the word was already spreading. The footage of her arrest was circulating. Veterans groups across the country were reposting. Advocacy networks like the ACLU had flagged the case. Legal influencers on TikTok were dissecting every frame of the video. Civil rights attorneys in Atlanta had already drafted a motion. And quietly, in Washington, D.C., a colonel in the Pentagon's Legal Affairs Division had forwarded the case file to the Department of Defense. Because Major Avery Sinclair wasn't just another name in the system. She was on active duty, protected by the Service Members Civil Relief Act. She had federal immunity from unlawful local prosecution. And the moment they laid hands on her, Wexler Ridge triggered a domino effect of federal oversight, military legal enforcement, and potentially constitutional violations. But none of that mattered to the officers in that courtroom. Not yet. To them, she was still just another one of them, a woman who didn't know her place. They were about to find out she did. It just happened to be about 5 ranks above their own. The courtroom still hadn't recovered from the shock of what had just happened. Major Avery Sinclair remained on her knees, hands cuffed in front of her, uniform creased but unshaken. The silence was weighty. It wasn't just humiliation, it was theater. Judge Denton, emboldened by the absence of pushback, leaned back in his chair like he'd won. SGT McLean smirked. O.F.C. Turner crossed his arms like a man who'd done this before. But they hadn't done this to her. Not to a U.S. Army officer who had more time in combat zones than either of them had in a courtroom. And certainly not to someone who knew the law inside and out. This was the first explosion point, where quiet dignity met brute authority, and every camera in the room was rolling. Outside the courthouse, a crowd was gathering. Not a mob yet, but something more dangerous for corrupt systems, concerned citizens. Word of the arrest had leaked from the jail the night before. A clerk had recognized Avery's name on the intake sheet and whispered it to a neighbor. That neighbor was married to a local teacher who posted about it on Facebook. By sunrise, dozens of people were waiting outside, many of them veterans. Some held signs, "Honor our soldiers." Shame on Wexler Ridge, but it wasn't until an anonymous teenager posted the first full-length video of the kneeling incident to TikTok that things truly spiraled. It was tagged with military injustice, police accountability, and veteran abuse. Within 3 hours, it hit 1.2 million views. Then came the journalists. Local affiliates at first, then national names. CNN, MSNBC, and even independent civil rights platforms started covering it live. This was the second explosion point, a digital wildfire that turned a small town abuse of power into a nationwide demand for justice. Back inside, Judge Denton called for a recess and retreated behind closed doors. Avery was led out of the courtroom, not to a cell, but to a side room with no windows. That's where the tone shifted. McLean, feeling the heat from the crowd, tried to assert control. "You caused this circus," he growled. "Could have just shut up like everyone else." Avery didn't flinch. She looked him in the eye and said quietly, "You don't get to silence duty with a badge. My oath outranks your orders." Turner, visibly sweating now, checked his phone and turned pale. A live news alert on his lock screen read, "Breaking. Active duty Army officer arrested in Georgia courtroom, sparks federal review." That was the explosion point 3, the moment they realized this wasn't just a mess. It was a federal disaster. And they were the epicenter. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, a U.S. Army legal liaison named L.T. Call Bennett received an encrypted file flagged urgent. Inside, video footage, court transcripts, jail logs, and the digital signature of Avery Sinclair. She recognized the name immediately. They had trained together at Fort Bragg. Avery wasn't just a soldier, she was a federal military asset protected under Title 10 and the Service Members Civil Relief Act. Within the hour, the Department of Defense issued a directive. All charges must be reviewed for constitutional and jurisdictional violations. Immediate inquiry into civil rights abuse authorized. By early afternoon, a military JAG, Judge Advocate General Officer, arrived in Wexler Ridge unannounced. This was the fourth explosion point when the system Avery had served turned its full weight toward defending her. But the real fuse had been lit before that, in a parking lot outside the courthouse, where a man named Raymond Carr stepped out of his pickup truck holding a file folder. Carr was a former internal affairs investigator for the Wexler Ridge PD. He had quit years earlier after trying to expose the same officers now holding Avery in custody. No one had listened then. But now, with the nation watching, Carr went straight to the press table and said, "I have evidence these men have been setting up citizens for years. They just picked the wrong one this time." Inside that folder were sworn affidavits, concealed disciplinary records, and copies of internal memos, one of which included instructions to show consequences to anyone who challenges court authority. Carr's documents, paired with the JAG officer's federal backing, obliterated the thin shield of local power protecting McLean, Turner, and even Judge Denton. Phones in the courthouse rang off the hook. Reporters camped outside. National civil rights attorneys began landing at the nearest airport. And inside the building where they once held complete control, the same men who demanded Avery Sinclair kneel were now being summoned, one by one, to answer for what they had done. Not just to her, but to an entire line of victims who'd lacked her rank, her resolve, or her visibility. Yet through it all, Avery said little. She didn't need to shout. Her restraint spoke louder than outrage ever could. It was power channeled through silence. It was black excellence, unmoved by intimidation. It was the unwavering poise of a woman who knew she carried not just a uniform, but a cause. And by the time the fourth explosion had cleared, there was only one question left echoing through the halls of that courthouse. Who's kneeling now? The Town of Wexler Ridge had never seen so many federal cars parked outside its courthouse. Suits with crisp lapels and briefcases moved through its narrow halls, their badges flashing silver and gold. Inside, whispers ran like wildfire. Is that the DOJ? Did the Pentagon really send someone? But none of them had the full picture. None of them knew what Major Avery Sinclair had done quietly strategically before this story ever made the evening news. Because while the nation had just begun to wake up to the injustice, Avery had been preparing for this long before the cameras arrived. See what Judge Denton, SGT, McLean, and Officer Turner never imagined that Avery Sinclair wasn't just a soldier trained in battlefield tactics. She was also trained in information warfare. And in her world, power wasn't just about force. It was about proof before she stepped into that courtroom. Before she ever raised her voice in defense of the Marine veteran on trial. Avery had already activated a device embedded discreetly inside her military-grade wristwatch. Issued to select officers returning from high-risk zones, the device was built to record audio and timestamp each segment under encryption. Legally admissible, chain of command protected. That watch recorded everything. The courtroom insults, the orders to kneel, the taunts in the holding cell, and the moment she was denied a phone call. Unlawful arrest, due process violations, abuse of authority. And she didn't stop there. While locked in the holding cell, Avery requested a pen and paper under the pretense of drafting a character statement for the judge. What she wrote instead was a full incident report complete with officer names, badge numbers, and timestamps from the audio file on her watch. She slipped that note into the lining of her boot. And when her cell was finally visited by a court-appointed nurse that evening, she handed it off. The nurse, an Army reservist herself, recognized Avery's rank immediately and followed protocol without hesitation. That note landed in the inbox of Lt. Col Bennett by dawn. What followed was not just a defense. It was a counterstrike. Within 24 hours, the Department of Justice issued a formal inquiry into civil rights violations and unlawful detention of active-duty military personnel. The American Civil Liberties Union launched an emergency review of Wexler Ridge's arrest records for patterns of abuse. And the National Military Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization specializing in protecting the rights of active duty service members, filed a federal lawsuit naming Denton, McLean, Turner, and the Wexler Ridge Police Department. But the most devastating blow wasn't legal, it was strategic. Avery didn't use the spotlight for herself. She used it to amplify others. In coordination with her legal team, she released a statement not from her own voice, but from the voices of others, dozens of past victims who had been wrongly detained, harassed, and abused in that same courthouse over the past 10 years. Names began to surface. Testimonies rolled in. The system that once protected its own now faced the one thing it could never suppress: documentation. Meanwhile, Judge Denton was served a federal summons at his home. SGT McLean and Officer Turner were immediately placed on unpaid administrative leave, their records flagged for federal review. Their faces, once anonymous behind uniforms, were now all over national media. Police misconduct, racial profiling, systemic abuse, abuse of power, the keywords exploded across search algorithms, driving millions of clicks to stories dissecting every minute of their interaction with Avery. And still, she remained composed. She made no victory speech, no grand gesture. When asked for comment, she said only, "I didn't come here to make noise. I came here to defend what's right." And sometimes that means kneeling for the moment, so the truth can stand forever. But behind the scenes, Avery had one more move. Alongside her legal team and a network of military-backed civil rights advocates, she initiated a class action lawsuit, not just for herself, but for all veterans, civilians, and service members who had suffered under Wexler Ridge's corrupt judicial practices. The lawsuit included previously buried misconduct records, internal whistleblower complaints, and financial irregularities from the courthouse's asset forfeiture program. What began as a viral clip of a woman forced to kneel was now a federal reckoning that threatened to shut down an entire department. And in one final twist, the nurse who smuggled Avery's note? She stepped forward publicly. Her name was Sergeant Lena Marquez, Army Reserve, 14 years in. She looked straight into a camera and said, "They thought she was alone in that cell. But when you attack one of us, you answer to all of us." By the time the smoke began to clear, the message was written across every headline: "Soldier silenced, system shaken." But those close to Avery knew the truth. She hadn't been silenced at all. She had just chosen to fight a different kind of war, a war for justice, dignity, and accountability, and she had won without ever raising a fist. They had made her kneel. But in doing so, they had exposed themselves. And now their badges were gone. Their power is undone. Their courtroom, the one where they thought they were untouchable, was now the scene of their own undoing. Because Major Avery Sinclair didn't just serve the country. She reminded it what service really means. When the dust settled and the courthouse doors finally closed behind the last of the reporters, Wexler Ridge was no longer just a quiet southern town. It was a case study in what happens when unchecked authority collides with quiet, unwavering strength. Major Avery Sinclair didn't demand attention. She didn't chase headlines or seek sympathy. She simply stood for what was right, even when forced to kneel. And that, in the end, was what changed everything. The two officers who humiliated her lost their badges. The judge who abused his bench was suspended pending federal investigation. And in the center of it all, Avery returned to base, not as a victim, but as a symbol. The Department of Defense, in an unprecedented move, awarded her the Distinguished Service Medal for her defense of constitutional rights on U.S. soil. Military leaders praised her not just for her courage under pressure, but for embodying the very values the armed forces are sworn to protect: honor, integrity, and justice. But Avery didn't want awards. She didn't need them. What mattered to her was the ripple effect. Following her case, over a dozen states introduced legislation expanding legal protections for active duty service members against unlawful detainment by local authorities. The Service Members Civil Relief Act was updated with new language informally referred to by some as the Sinclair Clause. Her story was taught in military ethics courses. Her silence became a rallying cry, and yet, the most powerful moment came weeks later, not in a courtroom or a press briefing, but at a small ceremony in her grandmother's backyard. Surrounded by family, friends, and a few fellow veterans, Avery helped unveil a modest plaque. It read, "For those who stand even when forced to kneel." It wasn't about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or erased, and who chose to rise anyway. In reflecting on Avery's story, we have to ask ourselves, how many others have been made to kneel in ways the world never sees? How many voices have gone unheard because they didn't wear a uniform or have a camera rolling? That's what makes this story more than viral. It's essential. Because what happened in Wexler Ridge wasn't just a moment of police misconduct or racial injustice. It was a mirror held up to the system. And it dared the rest of us to look. Here at Radio Life Stories, we don't just tell stories. We remember, we remind. We reclaim the narratives that were buried under silence. And Major Avery Sinclair's story reminds us that power doesn't always come with a badge or even a voice. Sometimes, power is the choice to hold your ground, even when your knees touch the floor. So if you've ever felt powerless in the face of injustice, let Avery's story remind you, dignity doesn't depend on how others treat you. It depends on how you respond. And sometimes, the most powerful act of resistance is refusing to break. If this story moved you, if it made you think deeper about justice, dignity, or the silent strength behind real service, subscribe to Radio Life Stories, because the truth deserves to be heard, and the fight for justice deserves to be told.